Hi, welcome to the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast. This is Katie from Fuel to Run. I'm a registered dietitian, sports dietitian, and running coach, and I'm one of the co-hosts of the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast. Today, I am doing a solo episode, so it's just going to be me doing a deep dive into high carb fueling, and so to give a little bit of background about this and kind of what exactly I'm going to be talking about, uh, basically, I'm going to run through kind of the history of carb fueling. So, like a little bit of a history journey. I'm not too much of a deep dive into the history, but just a little bit of a brief history of fueling and kind of where we are today. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is because recently in the London Marathon, we had two male athletes go under 2 hours. Sebastian Sawe got a 1:59:30, which is crazy fast. I mean, it's incredible. And so we have like this, I don't know, just this amazing thing going on in marathon running right now and in running in general, but mostly kind of marathon running, where athletes are just getting so fast. And so before we even dive into the carb thing, I think um, the reason I brought this up is because I think there are like a handful of things that are propelling athletes forward, that are helping athletes now break these like incredible barriers. And one of them is fueling, and specifically this like movement of extremely high carb fueling. And I do think that's moving the dial quite a bit. So I wanted to talk about that. I think there's more than that. I mean, obviously, it's not just the fueling. I mean, obviously, it's not like all of a sudden we're fueling with more carbs and that's allowing people to just based off of that alone run under 2 hours. No, it's like much more than that. There's shoe technology, which is getting better and better, helping people be faster and allowing people to be able to run those incredible speeds for like an entire 26 miles. We have these, shoes that are making huge difference in time. I don't think we would be where we are today with these times without the shoe technology. That's a huge factor. Obviously, the way we train is going to be a factor. So we have had some changes in just how athletes train, putting that training in physiology and knowledge of recovery and all of those things into practice. And athletes are just smarter about how they train. There's just a lot more resources available for athletes to be able to train hard and recover better. That's a big piece of it. So we've got a few things. So fueling, shoe technology, the way athletes are training. I don't want to dive into this too much, but unfortunately, I do think that probably there is a little bit of, for some athletes, and I'm not saying this is true for those two men that became under two, but I do think that drugs, could be a potential piece here. Again, I know that might get some pushback for that, and I mean, honestly, I really want to think that somehow marathon runners and runners in general are clean and that they're all following the rules, but the reality is that's not true. The technology we have for drug, evasion, people are pretty sophisticated in the way that they take drugs and administer them, and there's a lot going under the surface that we don't know there, and so it's hard to say. We probably won't know, and I know there was a lot of testing going on, especially with Sebastian Sawe. So we'd like to really hope in our heart of hearts that that he's clean, of course. But we don't know. I know it maybe not them, but there's obviously athletes that are kind of dirty in that respect, and um, I do think that's part of why everyone's getting faster. It's not like maybe the main thing, but we have to acknowledge that that's the case. And I wish running was innocent, but it's not. So there's a few factors going on there. Am I an expert in drug testing and drug how that works. Not really, but I think it's worth mentioning, because that's probably sort of under the surface a little bit of what's going on here. But I do think that a piece of it, of course, is fueling. And so that's what we're going to talk about today because that's really where my expertise is. So I want to focus on that. So lots of things going into these really fast times, fueling being one of them. I thought it would be just fun to talk about what's going on here and where we came from and where we are now in terms of fueling, especially during, and just kind of go along a little journey, let's say, of the fueling. So I have some notes I just want to look at. So if you see me kind of looking at that, I did take some notes. What's interesting is, we really started picking up running marathons more popularly in the late 1800s is kind of when the marathon became an actual race, an actual thing. Especially mostly men at the time are running marathons, Boston Marathon, the Olympics incorporated the marathon. So we start to see this in popularity of this much longer race, 26.2 miles. And when we first started when humans first started sort of popularizing this longer distance race, we didn't know very much at all about fueling. In fact, arguably we were doing a lot of things very wrong. And so that would be an interesting starting point. So let's kind of start back there in the late 1800s. Let's go through the history. So what were people fueling with at that time? Honestly, like the pre-race strategy would sometimes consist of things like eggs and steak. And so the belief at the time being that you needed to fuel with protein, maybe fat, but the idea of fueling with carbs, we just didn't have the knowledge at this point to say like, fuel with carbs. So athletes were actually fueling sometimes before races with, eating these high. I can even imagine having steak and eggs before my my marathon. So that's an interesting little tidbit there. There, water was, obviously they would maybe drink water, coffee or tea beforehand. Um, there wasn't like the aid stations that we have now. And so athletes initially were kind of like on their own to do whatever they needed to do. They didn't have these like perfectly nice aid stations with like little cups to drink from and like options for fueling. It wasn't like that at all. It was kind of like a free for all because mostly they didn't know what they needed. You just kind of ran and hoped you would finish in one piece and not bonk, I guess. Sometimes athletes during this time frame would drink, sometimes they'd eat like sugar cubes. So certain people maybe realize that there's that sort of initial like experimentation that's going on of like, oh, when I have a sugar cube or something like that, I feel a little bit better. So there was a little bit of that type of experimentation. But, the funny part is when I was doing some research is that alcohol was actually something that was often offered along the course. So whiskey, brandy, shots of alcohol, different various types, athletes would actually consume along their way in the marathon. So, you know, we know how bad alcohol is now. It's funny because I was um, volunteering at the Colorado Marathon a couple of weeks ago, and I was coaching an athlete, and I was trying to find her along the way to find a run with her as she was finishing up her marathon. And there was a table there that somebody was offering shots, and I was thinking to myself, ugh, like, I don't think I could do that during my race, but I know people do still. But we don't tend to ever see like the elite athletes, at least during the race when they're serious, having alcohol. I mean, I know there are some that maybe have a little bit of beer afterwards, or, we kind of see that a little bit when people are sort of doing it for fun, but it's definitely not a recommended fuel source. But obviously it's still being offered along the course. And I think most marathons, if you're running along, you can find somebody giving away shots or beer. But I don't generally think that's advised. It's just kind of funny because it still happens today. Sometimes they would have beef broth or, even eat protein or meat during. But most of the time there was just a whole lot of nothing being consumed during these marathons early on. In fact, dehydration was actually sometimes considered a benefit because the coaches believed that actually water would weaken performance. So you can see where they kind of had it a little bit backwards, where don't drink at all because if you drink, you're going to actually weaken your performance, which might be there might be some truth to that if all you're drinking is water and you're drinking a lot of it. But for the most part, there wasn't very much knowledge. And even in some cases, athletes who would stop to drink water, it was seen as a sign of a weakness. So, if you stop to have anything during your marathon, it was like, oh, you got to tough it out. You got to tough this out. We marathoners don't consume anything. You just got to do the race, see who's the last man standing. Um, so it's just interesting because I think that this is an extreme example, but there are certain things from our past, that sort of pervasive myths that still exist to today that we're sort of overcoming. Um, Maybe I would also argue we've kind of swung in this extreme opposite direction from that more recently, and I'll talk a little bit about that. It's kind of like, well, we went from like tough it out, don't drink anything, don't eat anything, to like let's stuff as many carbs as we can and hope it works, So it's kind of swung the opposite way. And sometimes, there is this for all of us who are maybe not elite athletes, we do have to consider balancing performance and health. And is it, we'll talk about the high carb movement, and is that really healthy for us to be consuming that many carbs? Um, and but I think in most cases, like even though there's this high carb movement, we still have a pervasive underfueling that's happening within the general athlete population. And so I do want to address that. Because I do think there's a lot of this, I think this general early on toughing it out mentality. I think a lot of athletes um, kind of still have some of this mentality. So I just had a few examples of nutrition strategies from these early days. So early Tour de France riders would sometimes drink wine during their races. So think about how it would be incredibly crazy, I think, these days to see, a Tour de France athlete drinking a bottle of wine or having wine, because they were so dialed in, with their nutrition now, and it's so competitive. I just think that probably wouldn't happen today. Um, like I said, marathoners once avoided water stations entirely, if there were water stations. And then elite cyclists, even up to the 1990s, often underfueled and intentionally to stay lean. So the power to weight ratio, and that still actually happens a bit today as well. That's not completely gone away. So what happened in like the 1940s to the 1960s? We started to have a lot more research into fueling. So we actually started to have scientists just be curious about what's going on. What do we really need when we're running? What's going on from a physiological perspective? And that's when we kind of discovered that muscle glycogen is a thing. So scientists actually found that there is a lot of sugar stored in our muscle and a little bit in our liver, and that when we exercise, we deplete that that glucose and that glycogen, and that's actually a big piece of performance. So we started to sort of put the pieces together of like carbs and muscle glycogen and hitting the wall and bonking, and so you have this realization that, oh, okay, when we're running longer distances, one of the limiting factors is glycogen. And when we deplete glycogen, that's associated with bonking. And so we started to discover that. Um, and the fatigue that comes with glycogen depletion, and that carbohydrates actually are the preferred fuel source for endurance efforts. So we're sort of starting to say, oh, well, maybe initially we thought protein was important. And then we're kind of coming this direction of like carbs are actually really important. There's a scientific understanding for that concept of hitting the wall. What does that mean? Well, it probably means glycogen is depleted. So in the 1960s, there is this realization that, oh, we actually need carbs. So carb loading starts to become popular. Athletes started intentionally eating more passive red rice, potatoes, things like that before their events. But I don't think there was a lot of a lot of consuming things during. I think some athletes were kind of discovering, there wasn't any products anyways. So that's part of the problem is if you were going to take in something during, you were kind of reliant on basic foods like bananas or potatoes or, things like that to bring with you. There were no goos, there were no specialty products, not in the 1950s and 1960s. There wasn't anything like that. So, athletes who were discovering that carbs were helpful were kind of playing around and having things that they brought with them. Um, and it was actually, though, in 1965 that Gatorade started. So they were from the University of Florida. The scientists there just decided to kind of make this sugar and electrolyte drink that they would give their football players. They kind of discovered that, oh, this is actually really helpful in, keeping them hydrated and delaying fatigue. And so that's kind of the initial start of Gatorade and that concept of like having a carb drink mix during exercise is actually beneficial. And so that's the conception, the beginning of Gatorade. And that's a kind of a cool history there. More and more athletes were sort of realizing the importance of carbohydrates. And researchers were finding that, it's probably better not, it's probably better to have carbs and electrolytes in the drink mix versus just water alone in terms of preventing things like hyponatremia and heat stroke and helping athletes compete better. So they were actually helping, at that point, we also kind of see a boom with the running back in the 1970s. There's kind of like this boom of running, like more and more people are running. You see women who are starting to run and getting into some of these marathons, even if they weren't allowed. And you have this sort of like back at that point, there was a big increase in like the uh, popularity of running in marathons. And so you kind of with that also see this like the science is growing, the understanding of the physiology and what's happening with the marathon is growing, and people are starting to recognize that they need to fuel and hydrate during, not just before and after. Like I said, most people were sort of eating things that they could find easily or access, the food items. And then it was until about 1994 that um, the company Goo, the gel Goo, they have the gels that you can take. They actually started in 1994. So we start to see like products. This is when we start to see the sports nutrition industry sort of start with different products that are available for fueling during activity. So I think Goo is a big one. There's others out there that kind of start around this era of not only Gatorade and with their drinks, but other types of drinks that we're seeing, and different types of sports nutrition products are starting to be developed to help athletes feel better. So we see this happening. It's also the around the time that sports scientists started to recognize that around this time, maybe late 1990s, early 2000s, hey, 60 grams of carbs an hour is about adequate. This is what we kind of would recommend most people do for fueling. Some of that is just based off of kind of where the limit is in terms of how much we can absorb. So in general, we can only absorb 1 gram of glucose per minute. So about 60 grams. If you add fructose in, it's about 0.8 grams per minute. So you can do about 1.8 grams per minute absorption of both together. And so that's a little more than 60 grams, yes, but there's a little bit of a limitation there. So I think generally it was like, okay, 60 grams, that's a pretty good amount per hour of carbs. And having some sort of mixture between maybe glucose and fructose is also helpful. So we're starting to recognize this, and athletes are starting to fuel a little bit more during exercise. But even then, I think pervasively, like not most athletes at this point were probably not generally getting 60 grams an hour. Partly because I think we're just learning about it, and there is this sort of history of sort of toughing it out. But we also have in the early 2000s this sort of realization that, well, yes, carbs are important, but we have all of this fat stored that we can use for fuel. And it's thousands of calories versus only maybe a couple thousand calories at most in glycogen. Now we have an abundant amount of calories that we have for fat. And so a lot of people, a lot of athletes and even, scientists and physiologists were saying, well, why don't we really focus more on tapping into fat stores? Can we make it so athletes can actually burn more fat and fuel that way so that we don't have to rely so much on carbohydrate because we have an abundant amount of fat. So it's really at this point we sort of see this high fat, low carb movement start to appear, not only with the general sort of keto people that are just trying to lose weight or do it for other reasons. We sort of see this also sort of coming into the endurance athlete community. And around 2010, 2015, it's getting a little more popular, with this era of athletes wanting to improve their fat burning capacity. Um, Unfortunately, with that, I do think that there is this that sort of happens. A lot of athletes are experimenting with that and maybe realizing that there's a limitation. You know, you can burn more fat at the expense of burning carbohydrate, especially if you're just doing keto and completely fat adapted. You can't maybe tap into some of those higher intensities. And so for more elite athletes, I think there wasn't a tendency for many elite athletes to go that direction, although there's probably examples of some, especially in the um, a community of ultra endurance, but really that sort of there's a limitation with fat. So we're starting to realize, okay, maybe it's good to be more fat adapted, but we want to be metabolically flexible, be able to use both fats and carbs, and we don't necessarily want to rely only on fat because there's a limitation with performance. There really is. There's no way you can be a high fat athlete and run a sub 2 hour marathon. There's just no physiological way because it takes so much oxygen to burn fat. You cannot tap into some of those higher intensities and be burning fat. Just physiologically, it's not possible. So I think that's kind of where, there's this movement. Okay, maybe that works for some individuals. Maybe it works for certain populations. Maybe it works for more of the ultra endurance crowd, but this isn't going to work for an elite athlete trained to train and run a really fast marathon. So we kind of start to recognize that sort of maybe, late two 2020, between 2015 and now, that's kind of being recognized. Some more research is coming out on that topic. Okay, we're not gonna go that direction. That doesn't seem to be feasible. So let's really focus on carbs in terms of like carbs are king for fueling athletes. This is really where people are going to see the most performance benefit. So I want to bring that up, but I do think because of that high fat movement, there are a lot of athletes that are still sort of confused, still sort of following the advice of, doing a lot of fasted training runs in order to be more fat efficient and maybe compromising their performance. And the other part of this here is that there is, I think, back to my college days and a lot of other athletes experience this, is this desire to be thin or lean. And I think there is still that even today of like, oh, if I fuel my body like before, during, and after, if I eat a lot of carbs, it's going to cause me to be fat, which isn't true. But I do think like a lot of athletes still think that way. And so I do think for the majority of athletes are still under fueling because maybe they think if I don't eat a lot of carbs, I'll be able to burn more fat. Or they think if I eat too much before, during, and after, it's going to cause me to gain weight. And so I think a lot of athletes are leaving a lot of their performance on the table. They're not realizing their performance. In fact, I even think back to my college days and I'm like, oh my gosh, if I had just known what I know now or implemented what I implemented now of fueling and really practicing some of this fueling strategies, I mean, imagine the athlete I could have been. I could have been so much better. And it's true. Like, I don't even know. It's hard for me to even think about what I would have been capable of had I had this information and been able to implement it when I was in college and in my 20s. I just feel like I would have had so much better performances. It's hard because you can't go back and redo things, but I wonder if that's true. I mean, I'm thinking that's probably true for so many athletes and like especially in the early 2000s. especially women athletes, like, gosh, so many of us would probably have been able to perform so much better and we didn't even realize our potential because we were intentionally underfueling thinking that it was gonna cause us to gain weight, and it's so not true, and it's sad, because I think there's a lot of that from college coaches or from coaches in general, like, "Oh, don't eat that," or "Don't eat, this," or "Don't eat carbs," or something, and, "You're gonna gain weight," and all of those messages, and it's just sad because it's so not true, and so now, I think now we're starting to kinda recognize that, like, "Oh, this is a problem," like, obviously, there's people speaking out against some of the coaches that maybe were spreading that sort of message, and now we're realizing, actually, it's better to be maybe a little bit heavier, but be really, really well fueled than to be super light and underfueled. And so that is changing, and that's part of this. But I do think that messaging is still kind of around, and I do think that mentality still exists today. I think that like tough it out mentality still exists today a little bit. I have a lot of, I have people I know that are maybe athletes that are 20 years older than me. Um, that sometimes I think when I'm, like, running with them or talking with them, and they're like, "Oh, I only do 2 gels during my marathon." Okay, that's really not enough, but it's like, "Well, that's what I've done, that's always what I've done. I've never done I don't this is what I do, this is what I've always done," sort of that mentality of like, "Oh, why would I change it if it works?" But it's kind of like, well, what if you actually fueled more? Like, maybe you would actually see better performance, right? So sometimes I think we're in this mentality of like, this is what I've always done. I've always done 30 grams of carbs an hour and it works for me. Or I've always just taken 2 gels. And it's like, well, that might get you through maybe, but what if you actually ate more carbs? Would you be able to finish the race feeling strong or finish, without kind of um, sort of slowing down at the end. So it is interesting how there is this sort of mentality of like, this is like the old school mentality. This is what we've got to tough it out. You got to, you don't. If you take too many carbs in, you're kind of weak or something like that. And so that's probably changing, but that's an interesting observation I've had of some of the runners who are maybe like uh, you know, a little bit on the older generation. So I think that just kind of thinking about that mindset from don't eat too much to fuel enough to perform, recover, and stay healthy. That is the difference. We have this don't eat too much, mentality that we're coming from maybe the early 2000s and the tough it out mentality, and now it's fuel enough to perform, recover, and stay healthy. That's where we're headed, and I think that's great. Um, I also wanna kinda mention this too, is that, around 2015 to 2020, that's really is when sports nutrition is becoming you have these products that come out, but the actual concept of, like, individualized nutrition is starting to become popular. Sports dietitians are actually a career that, people can can do, like, have a career helping athletes in individualized nutrition, so this is kinda when this is starting to become more and more popular. We have, the Breaking 2 project of, 2017. They did emphasize in that, like, the fueling and the individualized approach to everything they did, the physiology, the fueling, um, discovering that they could go beyond 60 grams of carbs and realizing that they had even better performance outcomes. So that's I think kind of where this momentum is starting with this higher carb era. And it's probably right around that time, realizing that sub 2 hour marathon is actually possible. And so we're starting to kind of see this momentum building of carb and the importance of carbs, and more athletes are thinking about how they're gonna consume more carbs during their races and fueling for training. So the modern strategies, that we're seeing now include, like, carb periodization or periodized nutrition, and I do talk about that topic, of periodized nutrition in our periodized nutrition episodes, but that is one thing that I think is really important to mention is that, maybe there is a role for doing some sort of low carb or fasted training or high fat low carb approach in a periodized training approach, where you would do that kind of in the off season and then maybe like add the carbs in. And so work on being more fat adapted and then kind of changing it up. So there may be a role for that sort of thing, or just even periodizing carbs differently throughout the training cycle based off of the intensity of the training, that kind of thing. The gut training is a big factor now. I think that's a topic that more and more athletes are interested in, is like, how do you train your gut to, because maybe the limiting factor is 60 grams an hour, but more and more athletes are finding that if they gradually sort of increase the carb content or the amount they can eat, and if they do so in a strategic way, they can actually consume way more than 60 grams because they've trained their gut to be able to tolerate that a little better. The precision with hydration. So now we have patches that you can wear that tell you how much sodium that you're losing in your sweat, and you can weigh yourself before and after exercise. You can get an idea of how much water you're losing, how much hydration you need, how much sodium you're losing. There's a lot more precision with that nowadays, that you can really dial in exactly what you need during marathon training or during a race. Things like continuous glucose monitors are kind of being utilized more and more now for athletes to be able to maybe see if like the carbs are enough, or get an idea. Obviously, that's not going to be of exactly a fuel gauge, and I've talked about that in our continuous glucose monitor episode. But it can be a way, along with other things that you're measuring, to sort of see, like, is the fueling adequately? Are you getting enough carbs before and during and after training? And it can be a tool that people are using now more and more in endurance sports. And now athletes are really doing high carb fueling of like 90 to 120 grams an hour, sometimes maybe even a little more than that, with the high carb fueling during races. And so we now understand that, at least hopefully most athletes are starting to understand, that underfueling really hurts recovery and adaptation. Energy availability like affects hormones and increases injury risk. So like if you are underfueling, you have hormone disruptions, injury risk, like bone injury risk, and it can negatively affect performance. And so I think there's now more and more of understanding of like, no, we're not going to tell our athletes that they need to be leaner. We're going to help them fuel smarter so that they can perform better. And that in the end is going to be more important than maybe even body weight alone, for most people. So let's move away from being lighter is better to fueling more is better, because that's really what we're starting to see, is that maybe weight makes a difference in some contexts, but being 2 or 3 pounds lighter isn't really going to make a big difference if you're not fueling well. So we're starting to see that, and that's becoming more and more with like RED-S and relative energy deficiency in sport, and more awareness around that. We're really seeing like, yes, underfueling is a recipe for disaster, and let's try to make sure we move away from that and move to more, how do we fuel your body? Fueling is part of training and not really separate from it. So it's all a part of it. It's like the training and then the fueling go hand in hand. It's not like you train and then you fuel. You train and you fuel, and it's all part of your process. It's all part of the training. You don't leave the house for a long run without your fuel. You how are you fueling during, and you're practicing your fuel just like you would practice anything other part of the training for a marathon. It's all integrated. It's not separate. And then there's a lot more awareness, like I said, around RED-S and chronic low energy availability. So just this, like, hopefully movement away from being lean, and that's better, to being fueled, and that's where we want to go. So it's interesting, all of these changes. And I think the other thing I want to talk about too is it's not just those things. I think there's also changes in the science, the technology around the sports nutrition products. So we have different things like super starches, like some, like UCAN does the super starch. We have the Morton, the hydro gels. And so these are just different ways of getting carbs that maybe slow down the process of So you're not having these simple carbs hitting the system. Like a super starch would be maybe more digested a little bit more slowly and released a little bit more slowly into the system. So you're not having this a bunch of sugar all at once hitting your system and or causing like a high concentration of sugar in the gut so that you have that digestive issue. The hydrogels are somewhat similar. The hydrogel kind of helps it absorb a little bit more slowly, get into the small intestine and absorb there. It's not maybe sitting as long in the stomach, so you have less issues of like that GI disturbance. And so you have these like different types of ways of administering carb. We're realizing that the more often you fuel, like if you can have a little bit more often, it's better than having like all lot at once. So, it probably wouldn't work well to have all 120 grams of carbs in one sitting. You want to sort of spread it out. Earlier and more often is better. So start early, fuel often. That's a good, strategy. We're starting to sort of see that, okay, these are all helping people be able to get more and more carb in, versus like, some of the products before were so concentrated in sugar and maybe didn't have the right formulation of like glucose versus fructose or things like maltodextrin. And there's just like different fueling formulations with some of these products that are helping people be able to get more carb in. Some of the super starch drinks and things like that, you may be having like different types of fuel. Like maybe someone would do like a super starch drink and a Morton gel, or maybe they would do like a fast acting carb and then a more like a slow acting carb, and combinations of different types of carbs help them be able to have more carb, and it's being digested in different ways so that you're not overloading just the glucose with just relying on glucose transporter. You're sort of having the carbs administered in such a way that it's not, you're digesting it more slowly, or you're getting like a quick burst of carb versus maybe a more slowly digested burst or amount of carb. And it's just like helping people be able to fuel and get more and get it, in different ways. And so there's so many different products out there, and it's just interesting because it is allowing athletes to get more. And I think the cool, you see a lot of athletes out there like pushing for that. Let me give you a few examples of athletes. With Sebastian Sawe, I did read somewhere that he had, and I tried to do some research to verify this. So, I might be wrong about the exact amount, but that he had about 120 grams of carb per hour, maybe a little more, during that marathon attempt, or that marathon where he did under 2. David Roach is one athlete who is a really big proponent of high carb fueling and does talk a lot about the carb piece. And notably, like during some of his winning races with Leadville, he had, I think, upwards of 120 grams. I can't remember the exact amounts, but really pushing that high carb fueling. He talks a lot about it. He has a YouTube channel, so you can check that out. But he does a lot, big advocate for the high carb fueling. More recently, I was watching something on the Cocodona 250, and Rachel, who won it, the woman who won it, I think, I don't know the carbs per hour or anything, but they were talking about how they were basically like dialing in her fueling, and sort of how she had a team almost of people working with her to try to fuel better for that race, and helping her have that individualized fueling approach of like, what are you going to have during the race? And it's kind of like they kind of described it as like an eating almost like a race where you run, but you're also eating a lot. You're almost eating competition in a way, because in those big races, those really long races, that's a huge factor. Talk about hitting the wall in a marathon. You have 250 miles. Like, how are you going to minimize some of the damage that incurs, especially when you're under fueling, and the muscle loss that must happen? Like, you've got to kind of eat a lot to really like make it through a race like that and be able to finish. And so, now we're seeing these incredibly long races. Fueling becomes such a big piece of that. It's interesting because you're seeing this and more discussion about it. But I want to sort of say, like, I think the turning point now is, okay, we're talking about this change that's happened over the past, I guess, more than 100 years. Like, from the late 1800s until now, we've seen this change in fueling, the change in understanding, the change in the science. The athletes are starting to realize, like, okay, if I take in carbs before and during and after, like, I recover better, like, I'm training, I'm able to perform better. Um, and now we're seeing this big push to like these high carb 120 grams an hour sort of situation. But I think it's important to recognize that, think about it. Is this something that all of us should be doing? Should we all be aiming for really high carb amounts during our races? And I think it depends a little bit because some of us, like, it depends on the intensity that we're training and running at, right? So the higher the intensity, the more carbs we need, the harder it is to get the carbs, because the more intense we run, the more there's blood flow is kind of being pulled away from the gut to fuel to help, fuel the muscles essentially. And so it gets harder and harder to get more carbs in. But the more intense we go, the more carbs we're burning. So it's an interesting thing. If somebody's just trying to finish a marathon, maybe they're doing it at a fairly easy pace, zone 2, their needs for carbs are going to be different. They may not necessarily benefit from pushing carbs all the way to 120. So we have this like high, it's just like, not every athlete may be, especially doing like a marathon, needs to have that much. But I do sometimes think like somewhere in the middle, maybe for most athletes, 60 grams is kind of the minimum. And the closer we can move to maybe like 80 grams, that might be a little bit better. But most of us may not be able to feasibly get to 120. I mean, that's a lot if you think about it. Like the athletes that are fueling that way probably have bottles, especially in the marathon. Like, some of these elite athletes, they have all their bottles on the course. They have it easy. They can like grab their bottle and put whatever they need, and they can put all their gels like taped to the bottle, and they have several bottles along the course, bottle stations where they have their individual unique, nutrition all dialed in there. And the rest of us, I mean, I've had that a few times where I've been lucky enough to be able to have my bottles on the course, and it's amazing. But for the rest of us, we have to rely on what's on the course, what we bring with us, right? And so that could be a lot of carbs, a lot of things to carry. So we have to think about that. The other thing we have to think about is the cost. I mean, some of these products are extremely expensive. I mean, like a lot. If you think about every day you're out fueling, and then also, the race and having to take things in during your long run, I mean, it can get kind of expensive if you're especially like Morton and some of these other products are a lot. And so I think then it does become a discussion of cost. Is it worth it to have to take some of these products or buy some of these products? Can you make some of your own? Some people, I've seen videos of people making their own, products. I think you can do that. You can make your own stuff if you can find something that works for you. I mean, some people rely on candy, maple syrup. You can buy the maple syrup gels, but you can just buy maple syrup and put it in a little container. And, you could buy one of those like little flask things. I mean, there's ways to do it, I think, to cut costs, but that is a piece of it. I think, for many athletes, it can become a cost issue. But I really do think like, no, I don't think every athlete would benefit from 120 grams an hour. But maybe moving the dial, if you're only consuming 45 or 50 or 30, trying to move it up to 60. And if you're consuming 60, maybe see if you can go up a little bit higher. And just kind of see how that feels. It's all about experimentation. How do you feel? What different products work? This is why it's just like training. You have to kind of practice these things day to day. You have to, not day to day, but just like in your long runs, and you have to kind of see what works, see what combination of things work. Are there things that you can buy that are more cheap, like candy, or something like just honey sticks, or something that you could maybe buy that are a little bit less expensive that you can incorporate to help you get there without the cost being so high. Some people like the idea of natural products. I mean, can you have things like dates and, I don't know, bananas? Like, that just seems hard to carry, but, are there things that you can incorporate that are more natural that still work for you without hurting your gut? So it's all about trial and error and experimenting to see what works for you. Some people like something very sweet, like the goos and different things out there that have very sweet tastes. Like, I personally do enjoy maple syrup gels, and I know they're like super sweet, but I do I'm just like a maple syrup fiend. So that kind of thing actually works well for me in combination with other products. So you have to really try, because you don't want to wait till marathon day and try to be getting 80 grams without trying different things ahead of time, and then maybe looking at what's on the course, what's available on the course, so you don't have to carry so much with you. If you like things like super starch, drink mixes, how are you going to have that on the course? That's something I'm thinking about, because I've used those during training, but it's like, well, then I'm gonna have to carry a bottle with me, and that's kind of a pain. So, am I going to rely on only gels, or am I going to actually try to carry something on the marathon course with me, because I'm not going to have bottles this time, unfortunately. So, these are all considerations that you have to think about when you're thinking about fueling. What's available on the course, what do you have to carry with you, how much do you have to carry, whatever you're using during practice, is it feasible to have it during the marathon or during your race or ultra marathon or whatever you're training for, or your triathlon? Is there a place to drop bag and grab stuff? So there's just a lot of things that you have to kind of plan for and consider. That's why this whole aspect of sports nutrition is something you need to be thinking of from like day one when you sign up, is like, what's going to be your strategy? What are you going to use? How can you kind of get the carbs up? Practicing it even during shorter training sessions and getting carbs in, so you can kind of know what it's like when you're running really intense. What's it like to take gels and other carb things? Because the intensity during a long, easy run is different than a short, than an intense, interval run. So like trying different things, figuring out what works for you during, post and also post workout. But really just seeing how, maybe even just experimenting, like how high can you go before it becomes evident that that's too much, or you start to have GI issues. So it's really that's kind of the fun part about it, is just being able to experiment with different things and try different products and try different amounts during training and kind of figure out what works best for you. And it may not be 120 grams, and that may not actually be ideal for you either. So it's really going to be individual, but it's probably more than 30 grams, and it's probably more than 2 gels in the entire marathon. So let's kind of move away from the underfueling piece and just trying to, and maybe not necessarily going to the extreme of the high carb, but maybe somewhere in the middle where it's 60 to 80, or experimenting a little bit to see what makes you feel your best, what helps you get through your training without, bonking, and coming up with a strategy for your race. And so that's really what I want to kind of advise people. I hope this was helpful to kind of go through a little bit of the history of fueling, where we are now, what might work best for you. Maybe it isn't 120 grams of carbs an hour, maybe it is. But thinking about it, moving away from this mentality of low carb, no carb, toughing it out, not fueling at all, and or only having 1 or 2 gels or something like that, and moving to a little more than that, but realizing that maybe we don't need like excessive amounts either. So I hope that's helpful. Just a little bit of my thoughts on the performances that we're seeing, my thoughts on the carb piece, obviously. And yeah, feel free to reach out to me at Katie. I'm on Instagram, the.running.dietitian, I think, at Instagram, and message me there. Fuel2run.com is where I'm at, or my website, or my email is also katie@fuel2run.com for email. So feel free to go ahead and get a hold of me there and message me with questions or thoughts or concerns or comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it and any questions you have about fueling. And thanks a lot. I hope this was a helpful thing to discuss. Bye.
That wraps up today's episode of the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast. Endurance sports have a way of teaching us patience, humility, and resilience, lessons that carry far beyond the workout. Progress in endurance sports doesn't come from shortcuts. It comes from consistency, discipline, and doing the work when it's not glamorous. Wherever you are on your endurance journey, keep trusting the process and honoring the work you put in each day. If today's episode resonated, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone to help on their endurance journey. Don't forget to join the conversation on our social sites to help build and foster a community where we all learn and support one another. We'll be back with more stories and insights from Coach Justin and Katie. Until then, visit the podcast website at theenduranceathletejourney.buzzsprout.com for more episodes from the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast. Have questions or comments about the podcast? Feel free to send us an email at theenduranceathletejourney@gmail.com. For all things coaching, visit Coach Katie at fuel2run.com and Coach Justin at tabularasaracing.com. Again, thank you for listening to the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast, and remember to find joy in the journey.